and you know, if you needed that for the points or whatever, you have to go. Okay, so today's lecturer is David Bacon. He's a photojournalist, labor organizer, and immigrant rights activist. We're very, very excited to have him here today. He's written many, many books, and he's a photojournalist, so his books have a lot of photos. He uses photos, interviews, and political analysis to tell the stories of immigrants and undocumented workers in the United States. And we hope that this photograph in particular will help you to think about your own projects, right? You're starting projects next week. So think about how he tells the story through his photos. So that might help with your presentation. But then maybe even more important than that, I'm hoping that Mr. Bacon will help you take a second look at immigration. Help you think about, you know, what are the reasons that people immigrate, migrate to a different country? What are the structural reasons, right? So some of it's a personal choice, but what are the things that actually sometimes force them into that choice? And then also, what are the structural reasons that create maybe a lack of opportunities in the new places that we go? Let's give Mr. Bacon a warm FYE welcome.
Well, thank you. Anyway, boy, that's kind of loud, huh? Well.
I can turn it down.
Oh, okay. 5 for 15? Are we going to 5 for 15? We know what we're talking about here? Who here works in a fast food restaurant? Anybody? Okay, well, you know, this is the National Day of Protest over the wages in fast food restaurants especially, and 5 for 15 means that we want the wages of people who work in fast food restaurants to go up to $15 an hour. So I know Sonoma State is a working class campus and a lot of you work for a living, and so I can imagine that you would be affected by this idea that we should be establishing $15 an hour as the base wage for people who work in fast food restaurants or doing the other kinds of work that our economy needs. So that's what 5 for 15 is about. And I was just out there this morning taking pictures at a McDonald's in San Francisco where young people took over the McDonald's and sat in for a couple of hours, basically trying to make the point with McDonald's that they got to raise their wages. At any rate, I am a photographer, so I'm going to show you some photographs while I'm talking today. And I want to start out by saying that, you know, we have a crisis of justice in our world here. I'm going to talk today about the right to stay home. And so to start with, let's take a look at people who have not been able to stay home. That is, people who have come here to the United States. And since 1994, about 8 million people from Mexico have come here as migrants to work in the United States. In 1990, there were about 4.5 million Mexican migrants living here. And in 2008, that number peaked at 12.67 million people. That's an enormous increase. That's 3 times. About 5.7 million people were able to get some kind of visa to come here. And then another 7 million people couldn't get a visa and came anyway, because there are not 12 million visas for people to come here. 9.5% of the people of Mexico live here in the United States. In fact, people have a concept for this in Mexico, which they call El Gran Mexico, which means the larger Mexico, the larger Mexico, which includes Mexicans living in the United States. In other words, you know, people are saying just because you go to the United States doesn't mean that you stop being Mexican or you stop being part of Mexico. And in fact, one of the most important movements in Mexico today is for the right to stay home, which is the right to an alternative to this kind of forced migration. So a little bit of history here. In 1986, the United States passed a law called the Immigration Reform and Control Act. That's our basic immigration law in the United States these days. And we remember it kind of as the amnesty law because it gave amnesty to about 3.5 million people who didn't have documents at the time. One of the things that that law did, though, was it also created a commission to investigate the causes of Mexican migration to the United States. And it made a report to Congress in 1992, and the commission found that the biggest reason was poverty. The commission argued that opening the border, the U.S. border, to the flow of goods and capital, but not to the flow of people, would in the long run produce jobs and rising income in Mexico, even if in the short run it predicted it would lead to the displacement of people. And so the negotiation of the North American Free Trade Agreement began within months of this report that the commission made to Congress. And 20 years later, we now have a scorecard on what actually happened. The promises of profits from increased investment and freer markets, those promises were kept. But the promises of jobs and benefits for working people were not. As that commission predicted, Nafta, the North American Free Trade Agreement, did lead to increasing unemployment and displacement and poverty in the short run. In fact, we're still waiting for the long run to happen here. Workers in all three countries are still living with the devastating consequences, while those predicted long-range benefits never materialized. And we can see why by looking at the activities of just one company, Smithfield Foods. In Veracruz, which is a state on the Atlantic coast of Mexico, Smithfield, which is today the world's largest meatpacking company, took a beautiful desert valley and it turned it into an ecological disaster by building the world's largest pig farm complex. Fausto Limon here, his family farmed in that valley for many generations. And over the last decade, his family all developed kidney ailments. And then they found that once they stopped drinking water from the well on their farm, those ailments and infections went away. And the reason was because Smithfield had contaminated the whole aquifer. Less than half a mile from his house is one of the 80 pig farms that was built by Smithfield in the Parode Valley, and each one of those farms raises 20,000 hogs a year. That's where the swine flu started. You know, we're not supposed to call it the swine flu, we're supposed to call it the H1N1 virus. But in Mexico, and here too for that matter, we call it the swine flu because that is in effect where it was incubated. Victoria Hernandez, who is a school teacher in La Gloria, which is a little town in the valley where the swine flu started, she said that her students told her that riding to school in the school bus in the morning was like riding in a toilet. And that's because they have these huge ponds of the pig caca that outside each one of these complexes, and you can imagine how much it is with each one of them raising 20,000 pigs a year. And for talking about it, Smithfield charged her, a school teacher, with defamation, which is a felony in Mexico, and kept her on trial for 2 years, basically in order to scare her and the farmers in the valley there into being quiet about it. This is David Ceja here, and he left his home in Veracruz near the Parode Valley, and he eventually went to the United States and he got a job at the huge Smithfield packing house in Tar Heel, North Carolina. And David says, "The free trade agreement was the cause of our problems. After the crisis, we couldn't pay for electricity. We just used candles at home. But when you see that your parents don't have any money, that's when you decide to come to help them." He says, "In Veracruz, we'd heard that there was a slaughterhouse in North Carolina. And when I was hired, I saw that everyone working there came from the area where I lived in Veracruz." So what produced migration from Veracruz and rural parts of Mexico was the same thing that closed factories here in California. Green Giant, for instance, closed its broccoli freezer in Watsonville, and then 1,000 immigrant Mexican workers, mostly women, lost their jobs because it moved to Irapuato in central Mexico, where the company could pay lower wages. So really, this trade agreement, NAFTA, it let huge US companies sell corn in Mexico, for instance, for a price that was lower than what it cost farmers in Mexico to grow it. And those big US companies, and we're talking about Cargill, Archer Daniels Midland, Continental Grain Company, they get huge subsidies from us, from our tax bill. Today is tax day. So you think about the money that we're paying in taxes. Part of it goes to those corporations in the form of subsidies. And so those companies, they took those subsidies and they used it to subsidize their cost of production so that they could then sell corn in Mexico at 19% below what their cost was to grow it. And they have huge economies of scale, much bigger than Mexican producers do. So the imports of corn into Mexico went from 2 million tons to 10 million tons a year from 1992, which was before the treaty went into effect, to 2008, which was about 16 years afterwards. What did that mean to Mexican farmers then? What it meant was that hundreds of thousands of farmers could not make a living. They couldn't sell their corn for a price that would pay for the cost of growing it. Now, some of these farmers in states like Oaxaca, for instance, are living in communities where people have been growing corn for thousands of years. In fact, they have found a cave near Oaxaca City where they have found the first corn cobs that are the first ones that were domesticated by human beings. We owe the cultivation of corn to these communities where it happened to thousands of years ago. And now the people who live in those communities are leaving because they cannot survive. They cannot grow corn for a living. According to Fernando Ortega, who is the state coordinator of the Democratic Farmers Front of Chihuahua, another state in Mexico, he says, we became impoverished and dispossessed, and the government abandoned us and excluded us from development. By negotiating this treaty, the government promoted the violence and the growth of organized crime in all the rural parts of Mexico. Now, Chihuahua is the state where Juarez is the biggest city, and I think most of us have heard about Juarez as being this incredibly violent place. And what he is saying here is that there is a connection between poverty and the poverty that is caused by these economic changes, especially this trade agreement, and the development of violence and narco traffic in Mexico. The lack of labor rights also, combined with these kinds of economic reforms to benefit large corporations, is also a source of migration. The Mexican government, for instance, sent in the army to all the power plants in Mexico several years ago and fired 44,000 workers in order to be able to privatize this company that's provided electricity and power to Mexico City in central Mexico. The government wanted to destroy the union because it was standing in the way of the privatization of this company. And then last year, the government finally changed the Mexican Constitution, which said that oil and electrical generation were things that belonged to the people of Mexico and the government of Mexico so that it could be sold off to private owners. So 44,000 people lost their jobs in order for this to happen. What's going to happen to those people? Where do you think they're going to go? The head of the miners' union in Mexico, a man named Napoleon Gomez Urrutia, was forced to flee Mexico to Canada because the government threatened to arrest him after he had condemned the government and a large corporation for industrial homicide after a mine explosion in northern Mexico in which 65 people died. Meanwhile, Mexico passed a new mining law that led to the sale of mining concessions primarily to huge Canadian companies. And remember, the North American Free Trade Agreement also includes Canada, covering a third of Mexico's territory. In other words, they've turned over a third of Mexico's territory to mining companies, which says that they can use this land for any purpose that they essentially want. There's a small town south of the border with Arizona called Cananea, which is where the Mexican Revolution actually started back in 1906. In Cananea, the miners have been on strike there for 8 years to stop this mining corporation, Grupo Mexico, from eliminating their jobs and busting their union. Now, when miners in Cananea and little towns like that lose their strikes and their jobs, remember the border is only 50 miles north. So, where are they going to go? Where are people going to do in order to survive? These miners who are on strike in Cananea or the electrical workers who lost their jobs in privatization in Mexico City, what they're really fighting over, what they're fighting for, is for the right to stay in Mexico. Because when the company gets privatized or when the strike gets lost, what it really means is that you lose your job and you have to do something in order for your family to survive. And that something really means that you have to leave home in order to find work somewhere else. In a Tijuana factory, assembling flat panel televisions for export to the United States, a woman on the line has to work for half a day in order to buy a gallon of milk for her kids. Maquiladora workers, they live in homes that are made from pallets that are cast off by the factory, in barrios with no sewers, with dirt roads, no running water or electrical lines. And because our two economies are linked, Mexico suffers when our economy takes a dive. When the current recession started here in the United States, what did it mean? It meant that we stopped spending money. We stopped buying what those factories producing the televisions were making. What happened to the workers who were working in those factories? They got laid off and they lost their jobs. These factories are right there on the border. What do you think those workers had to do in order to put food on the table for their families? Where were they going to go? These kinds of market reforms, economic reforms, they privatized other industries as well too. One family became the owner of all the most important railroads in Mexico, another of its steel mill. Carlos Slim bought the telephone company, Mexico's telephone company, at a bargain price, and he is now reputedly the world's richest man, even ahead of Bill Gates, and he's become the second largest shareholder in the New York Times. So if you open the New York Times and you read all of these stories saying that Nafta and free trade are a wonderful thing, you can imagine what the reason for that is. Last year, teachers went on strike all over Mexico because they were trying to defeat a kind of education reform that was invented in the United States. Standardized testing, with teachers fired if the test scores of the students don't rise fast enough. The people who were, the young people, the 43 young people who were kidnapped and the 3 who were killed outright in Ayotzinapa, and I don't know if you went and heard the parents and the students a couple of weeks ago in Santa Rosa talking about this. They came from a teacher's training school in Mexico that the government is trying to close down as part of these education reforms. That's one big reason why these students were murdered. These teachers, these students are upset, not just because of the loss of the school and the loss of jobs, but because there is so little alternative to migration for young people who are growing up in Mexico today. Juan Romaldo, who's a high school teacher here, he says, migration is a necessity. It is not a choice. 75% of the 3.5 million people who live in Oaxaca live in poverty by the government's own statistics. 45% of the people in school in Mexico, 45% of students don't finish elementary school. So in Mexico and in developing countries all over the world, because although we're talking about Mexico here, these same rules apply to Jamaica, to the Philippines, to El Salvador. All over the world, people want an alternative to this. And who wouldn't? People want a right to a decent life in the communities where they are living. That's what the right to stay home is. The right to have a decent life where you are. It's not that people think that migration is a bad thing, but they say it should be a choice. It should be something voluntary, not something that is forced on you because the only alternative is hunger. Here in the United States, our economic system here depends on migration and migrants. If everybody went home tomorrow, everybody who lives here who was born somewhere else, and we're talking about 45 million people, would there be fruit and vegetables on the shelves in Safeway? Who would cut up the cows in those meatpacking plants? Who would be cleaning the offices? Who would be working in the food service and the building services right here on this campus at Sonoma State? I'm not saying that immigrants are the only workers here. You know, our working class is very diverse in this country. You know, we have African-American workers and Chicanos and Filipinos and Chinese and white workers. We all work. We all need to work in order to be able to put bread on the table for our families. But we have to get real about something, and that is, without the labor of today's migrants in this system, the system itself would stop. So ask yourself then, who pays for the needs of the workers' families in the towns that they come from? Remember, if those towns in Oaxaca or in the Philippines or in El Salvador stop sending people into the economy here, what happens? What happens to certain industries, whether it's agriculture or meat packing or janitorial services? Those things stop. So do you think that the growers or the building owners pay for the cost of sending those workers into our economy, pay for the services that their families need in the towns where people are coming from? They don't pay for anything. Workers pay for it all through the money that they send home, working here, sending money back to their families. So to employers in this country, migration is a labor supply system. And for them, it works very well. So what I'm saying here is our trade policy and our immigration policy are inextricably bound up with each other. They're part of the same system. Here in the United States, people without papers pay taxes and Social Security. Almost everybody who works for a living, with or without papers, gets a paycheck and gets those same deductions made out of their paycheck. But if you don't have any papers, you cannot collect the benefits that those deductions are paying for. There's no unemployment insurance, there's no disability, there's no retirement. You know, these are things, they weren't gifts from the sky here. These are things that working people fought and won in the New Deal. Our families, our grandparents and great-grandparents, they won these things with struggle. But people without papers are excluded. If employers in this country had to raise the wages of immigrants to the level of longshoremen, it would cost them over $80 billion a year. So it's no wonder that they don't want immigrants, whether they work in a fast food restaurant or as a janitor or out in the fields, to have a union, for instance, or to have a workers' center. Nafta, the North American Free Trade Agreement, it didn't just displace Mexicans either. It displaced people in this country as well. Until 2005, our Department of Labor in the United States kept track of workers who could show that their employers had moved their jobs to Mexico. And in 2005, President Bush ordered the Department of Labor to stop counting because the number had gotten to be over 600,000 jobs that we had lost here in this country, and it was embarrassing in the middle of an election. By 2010, trade deficits with Mexico eliminated 682,900 good U.S. jobs in manufacturing, according to the Economic Policy Institute. Well, what happened to those people? In our country, there was another connection, another consequence of the connection between NAFTA and immigration policy. Enforcement, immigration enforcement at the border, in raids in communities, in raids in workplaces, that took off as well too. Our immigration policy especially turned people without papers into criminals. So here's a criminal. This is Teresa Mina. She was a janitor. She lived in San Francisco for 6 years. She came from Veracruz also. For those 6 years, she couldn't see her children grow up because she couldn't go home. And she couldn't go home because she couldn't pay the thousands of dollars it would have taken for her to cross the border back into the United States afterwards to go back to her job in San Francisco. So for those 6 years, when they had birthdays or it was Christmas, they talked on the phone. That was how she knew her kids. And then she got fired because she didn't have papers. So she said, I felt really bad. After so many years of killing myself in that job, I needed to keep it so that I could keep sending money home. She said, this law is very unjust. We work day and night to help our children have a better life or just to eat, and now my children won't have what they need now because I can't work. Now, Immigration and Customs Enforcement, which is a part of the Department of Homeland Security, ICE, says that they are auditing the records of 2,000 companies this year alone, which means that thousands and thousands and thousands of people, like Teresa Mina, have been fired and are going to be fired. Over the last 4 years, hundreds of thousands of people working with bad Social Security numbers have been fired. Many of them are union members with stable jobs that paid enough to send a kid to a college like this one here at Sonoma State. In fact, I would bet you that there are people sitting here in this audience whose parents, because of their jobs, have been able to send them here. So what's happening then when people lose those jobs because of this kind of enforcement? Our government is pushing people onto the sidewalk as day laborers, where nobody is going to ask you for your papers, but your wages are minimum wage at best, and sometimes even less than that. That doesn't create any jobs for anybody. Instead, what happens is that people lose their homes when they can't pay the mortgage or the rent. And this kind of enforcement, it doesn't punish employers who exploit immigrants. They get rewarded for their cooperation with firing their own workers by being immunized from prosecution. So this policy really only hurts workers. And even more important, it has an impact on the ability of people to create social change. At Smithfield, at that plant, at that meatpacking plant where David Ceja got a job, in North Carolina, they had 2 immigration raids and 300 firings, basically so that people would get so scared that they would stop trying to organize a union. But then the Mexican workers and the African American workers in that plant, they found a way to make common cause with each other, and together, after 16 years, they brought that union in. And that common cause was then they were able to say to each other, we all need better wages and conditions, and we all have a right to work here and to fight for them. Now, Detroit, think about Detroit. The last few decades, Detroit lost half its population when the auto industry left. Today, every engine in a Ford comes from Mexico. But the working people who lost their jobs, and they didn't just disappear. Instead, what happened is that hundreds of thousands of people began an internal migration within the United States here that was larger than the migration that we hear about of the Dust Bowl era of people coming up from the South in the 30s. Former machinists and factory workers, they went on the road, they got jobs at minimum wage in fast food restaurants, or they simply lost their families and began living in the street. Does firing somebody for working in a cafeteria create jobs or end poverty? We need better priorities to take care of everyone. People like Bill Davidson here. He came home from the Iraq wars and he wound up living on the street with Ebony Brown in a shelter that they built in an empty lot under a freeway in Oakland. Wade Williams here. He lost his home in a foreclosure. Today he's sleeping on a bus bench. Is throwing undocumented workers out of their jobs and out of their homes creating a home for Wade or a job for Bill Davidson? During this period, when this trade agreement has been in effect, our wages here in the United States have remained virtually flat. In other words, prices went up, but our wages didn't. In 2006, the Economic Policy Institute found a nationwide loss of $7.6 billion in wages that would have been earned if our trade had been balanced. And in 20 years, the number of people in the United States who were born somewhere else went from 23 million to 42 million people. This is the period in which that trade agreement went into effect and in which these kind of market-based economic reforms were implemented in countries, whether it was the Philippines or El Salvador or Mexico or Jamaica, which are the sources of migration to this country here. So the reality is that this system produces displaced people, and then it criminalizes them when they migrate. It makes people vulnerable, and their low wages then turn into higher profits for the companies that employ them. Last year, 409,849 people were deported from the United States, which was an increase over 396,000 from the year before. Every year, over 350,000 people spend some time in a privately run detention center for immigrants. Now that's a euphemism. What's the real word for a privately run detention center for immigrants? What should we call it, do you think? You have any idea what I'm talking about? What is it? What is a privately run detention center for immigrants? It's a prison. It's a jail. Our border, if you go down to the border with Mexico, is like an armed camp. We now have 20,000 Border Patrol agents on our border, which is far more than we have ever had in our history as a country. We are spending more money on immigration enforcement than all the other law enforcement programs of the federal government combined. In other words, if you put together the budget of the FBI and the DEA and alcohol, tobacco, and firearms and the Secret Service and all the rest of them, and you put them all together, it does not equal the budget for immigration enforcement alone. People like Bert Corona here, who was the father of our modern immigrant rights movement in this country, they had an alternative to this system. Bert said, first of all, that immigrants are not helpless. They are not victims. He said immigrants are fighters. And I think that we know that this is true, because if we look at what the labor history just of Sonoma County here, who was it that organized the unions in the fields, in the wineries, and the people who work in the wineries? Who was it that organized the Sonoma County Industrial Union back 20 years ago? Who is it that represents workers and organizes workers today in factories and office buildings and laundries and hotels and fields? Again, I'm not saying that immigrants are the only workers or the only people who belong to unions or the only people who are willing to fight for something better, but they are a very important part of it. So we don't want immigration reform that means that thousands, even millions of people get fired. So when you look at those bills that are in Congress that are presented to us as being the amnesty bill that's going to make life better for immigrants, you have to take a look at all of the different pieces of those bills, not just the part that is going to help people get legal status. And in all of them, including in President Obama's order, executive order, that he issued last fall, where he said that he was going to help as many as 4.5 million people get legal status here, what he also said was that he was going to increase enforcement on the border, he was going to increase enforcement in the workplace in this kind of grand trade-off. Well, what happens? Again, remember, what happens when immigration enforcement gets ramped up? People lose their jobs, people become vulnerable, it becomes much more difficult for people to organize. If people have rights, people will organize. People will try and get something better. So we need immigration reform that increases people's rights rather than making them the victims of enforcement. Gaspar Rivera Salgado here, who's a professor at UCLA, the first Mixteco professor that we've had in the United States, an indigenous person born into a community in Oaxaca, was one of those ones that we were talking about where corn cultivation first started. Gaspar says, we want immigration, amnesty, and legalization for undocumented migrants, but not guest worker programs. We need the right to work, but with labor rights and benefits, not slavery. And at the same time, we need development back in Oaxaca that makes migration a choice rather than a necessity. That is the right to stay home. And that means what we need are schools, healthcare, jobs, and good prices for corn and agricultural products. So what Gaspar is saying is that these rights are linked together. The right to stay home and the right to equality and dignity when you do migrate, they're connected to each other. In fact, you can't have one without the other. So the question we need to ask is not what Congress is going to vote for, because we know what Congress is or isn't going to vote. Congress isn't going to vote for any of this stuff right now. What we need to talk about is what we actually need. What is actually going to solve our problems as working people? So the first thing is we want and we need legal status for everybody. We need green cards so that people can lead normal lives with families, being able to join our communities and live in our communities as just like everybody else. We need to get rid of those detention centers, those privately run immigration prisons. No more ankle bracelets for people who get released on bond. No more firings because you don't have papers. We need to get rid of the guest worker programs that treat people as though the only thing that they are good for is to work here, and that if you're not working, get out. People need to have rights, and people need to have families, and people need status that is going to give them that. And people's families in Mexico and Guatemala and El Salvador and the Philippines, they all deserve a decent life too. Young people especially who are growing up have a right to not migrate. And for that, we have to change these trade agreements like Nafta. We have to stop the administration from negotiating yet another one, the Trans-Pacific Partnership, which is on the table in Washington, even as we're talking here. So is this possible then? You know, in 1955, if you were black and you tried to vote in Mississippi, you could be lynched or your home and your church got bombed. But then 10 years later, the Civil Rights Act was passed. In 1954, there was no union for farm workers. Growers filled the fields with braceros, who were these sort of indentured workers that they brought from Mexico, guest workers that they could treat like slaves. And then in 1965, people like Bert Corona and Cesar Chavez and Dolores Huerta and Ernesto Galarza, they went to Congress and they told Congress, first of all, to end the guest worker program, end the bracero program. And then as soon as they did that, a new union went out on strike in Delano, which was the United Farm Workers. And we got the family preference system today instead of, as a way of coming to the United States, instead of a slave labor program like the bracero program. Who made this happen? We did. Our mothers and fathers, our grandparents, they organized the civil rights movement, and that's what we need today. We need a movement that is that strong and powerful and it's as willing as that to fight for what we really need. Now, you know, they're trying to push us backwards, really. A lot of these proposals are. They want to start, for instance, pulling apart the family preference system, which we got as an alternative to this sort of slave labor program. What that means is that people are not going to be able to bring their brothers and sisters here to the United States any longer. No more adult children, as though people stop being parts of our families because they have the wrong relationship, brother or sister, or because they grow up, because they become adults. Instead, employers in this country, including growers right here in this county, what they want are more guest workers, because what they want are people who are just here in order to work. So really, whether we live in the United States or in Mexico, we face the same kind of economic policies. We face the same trade policies. We even have the same employers. So the only way that we can survive is by reaching across the border and cooperating with each other. Solidarity. Solidarity is the only way that we can survive. So a social movement today that crosses borders can make what seems impossible today, because we look at Congress and we know it won't move, possible tomorrow. We can have a world that respects human rights. We can stop deportations. We can have a system of security for working families on both sides of the border. And this is possible. Sí se puede. Thank you. Well, first of all, we need to defend the executive order that President Obama issued. which would help people to get legal status, even if there are parts of that order that we don't like. We need to at least try and get something good out of it. And the way that we got President Obama to do that to begin with was by demonstrating, was by going out in the street, marching, by sitting down in front of buses that were taking people to detention centers. So we need to keep the pressure up on the president and keep it up on Congress. You know, May Day is coming up, and May Day since 2006, for the last 10 years, has been the day of all days in the year when we go out into the street and we really show what it is that we want and how many people are for it. So I would say, get busy, help organize the May Day March. I know there's going to be one in Santa Rosa here this year. You know, you can become part of the organizing committee for it. Help it make it as big as you can.
Are you saying that someone who came into this country legally should have all the same rights as legal Americans?
Basically, yes, that's what I'm saying. I think that people came here without papers, not necessarily out of greed or to try and trick the system. People overwhelmingly have come here because they, because of the lack of an alternative in the places where people are coming from. So one of the ways of dealing with the pressures of migration is to get rid of the trade agreements, is to make it possible for people to have a decent life in the places where they're already living, the places where people have been living for many generations and where people are growing up now. You know, the conditions of life in a town in Oaxaca are not just something that affects the people who live in that town. It affects us here. So if you see, for instance, people who are demonstrating for human rights in Oaxaca, like the parents and the students from Ayotzinapa who are here in Santa Rosa, go and hear them, hear what they have to say, hear what they're trying to tell us about the need to defend the rights of people who are looking for change in Mexico. But we also have to recognize that part of the pressure that's on people to leave is coming from here, is coming from the laws that we pass, like the trade agreements, and is coming from the activities of corporations here who are making money off of this system. So we need to stop that. In terms of the rights that people have here, you know, our experience as a people in this country is that when we become divided into a society in which one part of the population has rights and another part of the population doesn't, we all suffer as a result of that. That was the story of the civil rights movement, was to fight against that kind of two-tier idea. If you go back 100 years in this country, people would have asked, are you seriously expecting that African American or black people in this country should have the same rights as white people? And when we hear those questions about people's legal status or where they're coming from today, it has in it that same idea that we should be a society in which some people have rights and other people don't. And what that does is it really pushes all of us back. So we need to live in a society in which we have rights across the board, where all of us can live decent lives as families, where we have the rights to a decent, you know, standard of living, and where we can all kind of make mutual progress with each other.
Second question is, I agree that we need to help out everyone, but as a nation who has enough of its own problems, shouldn't we help out the legal poverty-stricken individuals before we start helping illegal immigrants or face the issue of the still racist issues?
Well, that's really kind of a similar question to the last one. We need a different set of economic priorities in this country to begin with. We need an economy that serves the interests of working people. Rather than giving charity to one group of people or another group of people, what we need is for working people across the board to be able to make a decent living and to have some security, both as families and in terms of our income and in terms of the social possibilities that are open to us. So what we're arguing for here is not charity. What we're arguing for here is the ability for people to advocate and organize for something better. And we are much more successful as people if we can organize across the lines of race and nationality and legal status than if we become divided and get kind of pitted against each other, in which we say that, the rights of one group of people can only come at the cost of the rights of another group of people. Basically, we all kind of go up together, or we're all going to go down together.
Another question was, why don't many working citizens of the United States identify with other workers who aren't citizens?
Well, I think that has a lot to do with, first of all, how we get taught to see the world. We are all the products of the schools that we go to, the TV that we watch, the newspapers that we read. And so first of all, a lot of times the message that we are getting is that, that other people are out to kind of do us in. That if we have a job, that there are other people out there who don't have a job and who would willingly come and take our job if we let them do that. So we kind of live in a society in which people are forced into competition with each other, and that competition is real. We have a lot of unemployment, especially as we saw in this last recession. So really what we need is to be able to kind of see how to put people to work, for instance, who don't have jobs, rather than saying, well, okay, if I have a job, I have to be afraid of somebody out on the street who might be willing or able to take it from me.
I'm aware that most will argue that if all of the immigrant workers left, all of those jobs would go to the unemployed Americans. What do you want to say to them? Are they necessarily wrong? Or did they come here illegally, so why is it wrong to fire them?
Unemployment in this country is not created by people who are coming here from some other place and then taking the jobs that belong to somebody else. Remember what happened to Detroit. The devastation in Detroit, was that caused by people coming here from Mexico or from the Philippines or from some other country? It was caused by the decision of auto companies to take what was being produced in those factories in Detroit and move that production to countries where they could pay a lot less money. Now, unions who are looking at that problem are beginning to see that the answer to it is to be able to bring together workers in this country with workers in other countries so that we can kind of face General Motors or face Chrysler together, rather than always undercutting each other, saying that, well, we're willing to go to work at a wage that's less than the country in some other part of the world. So the answer to the devastation of Detroit is in part kind of an internationalism among workers that allows us to cooperate with each other across national borders. But it's also a question of what our economic priorities are. Our tax money, for instance, that we are paying today, on April 15th, most of our tax money goes to the military budget. It doesn't go to housing. It doesn't go to education. It doesn't go to social services. We need to reorder our economy so that the money that we are producing in taxes goes to the creation of jobs, goes to the creation of an economy in which we all benefit. That is going to raise the standard of living and produce jobs for everybody. So the way of producing jobs is not to sort of this sort of zero-sum game of trying to bump somebody else out of a job because of their legal status, or because they're a woman, or because they're black, or because they don't believe the right thing. That doesn't create any job. It's just a fight over who's in that job. We need to create jobs by basically having more control over what large corporations do, by having more control over what the government does with the money that we give it.